How did she know where the guns were when no one could see them? For 1,904 days, the 9th Valley Brigade had survived artillery, encirclement, winter starvation, and roads so cratered ambulances rode like boats through broken stone. But nobody in the buried command post had ever seen a counter-battery solve done by hand in under a minute. In the next 83 seconds, one correction of 31 mils and one grid accurate to within 46 meters would save 417 soldiers and civilians jammed on the eastern road from being erased in darkness. And the person doing it was not the colonel on the command net, not the forward observer on the ridge, not the gun captain screaming into the field phone, but the nearly invisible lieutenant in the headphone harness, ink on her fingers, a brass slide rule pressed against her ribs, listening to war arrive through 6 trembling lines of sound. The bunker smelled of wet concrete, hot copper, and stale coffee, so old nobody bothered pretending otherwise. Maps shook on the wall. Dust fell in gray threads. Somewhere above them, a shell walked across the road. Another followed. Closer. Lieutenant Mara Varand did not blink. She listened to the first muzzle blast hit post 3, then post 2, then post 5. She marked the delays on smoke paper with the point of a steel stylus. 2 tenths, 4 tenths, 7. She ignored the shouting, ignored the impact reports, ignored the man at the radio saying the road was full of children in blankets and wounded men tied to truck beds because there were no stretchers left. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet the room leaned toward it. Battery line northeast. 3 guns. Grid 1842, 6637. Shift right 31 mils. Fire when ready. Nobody in that bunker understood, in that moment, why the quiet woman nobody noticed had just become the one person standing between the brigade and annihilation. But by the end of this story, you will. If this story grips you, subscribe and follow along softly if you want more stories told this way. Drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. Colonel Stephen Radin had spent 30 years around artillery and had learned to distrust 2 kinds of confidence. The loud kind that arrived before the first round, and the silent kind that arrived from people too young to know how much could go wrong. Mara Varin was 29, mud on her knees, headset wire-tucked under her collar, and she carried silence like some people carried rank. That was one reason he had almost left her behind. The other reason was simpler. Sound-ranging officers did not usually crawl forward with cable crews under live shelling. They worked behind grease pencils and plots. They made corrections in dry rooms. They were supposed to survive, so their numbers would. Then the road began to die. The Eastern Road was not much of a road anymore. It was a stripped ribbon of frozen dirt where trucks coughed smoke and stumbled around axle-deep holes. Refugees moved in the margins with blankets tied over their heads against the sleet. Half a company of engineers tried to keep the bridge plates aligned with crowbars and curses. Somewhere farther back, a mule screamed. Shells landed in a line precise enough to say intelligence, not chance. That was what made Raiden turn and really look at Mara. Harassing fire drifted. Fearful fire wandered. This did not wander. It corrected. That meant observers. Or mathematics. Or both. Mara had already slid the smoke paper drum into the recorder. The 6 microphone posts lay buried in shallow snow along a curved baseline west of the road, each one surveyed to the meter, each one connected to the bunker by field cable already cut twice that week. When the enemy battery fired, each post heard the low, rolling belly of the muzzle blast at a slightly different time. The recorder etched 6 thin deflections across blackened paper. Human panic looked like chaos. Artillery never did. Artillery had habits. Delays. Signatures. Distances. A gun always told the truth before the men around it did. Post 4 is dead, Sergeant Bellick muttered, one hand pressed over an earphone cup. Cable's gone. Mara nodded once. 4 good posts were enough if the geometry held. 3, if she trusted the asymptote and accepted a larger probable error. Tonight error could not be large. 1 bad grid wasted a volley. 2 bad grids turned the road into a trench full of burning cloth. A shell hit somewhere above the bunker, and the light flickered brown. Raiden's hand closed on the back of Mara's chair. Can you solve it? She looked at the paper. Already did. That irritated him. He almost smiled. Almost. He had seen dozens of officers bluff in order to buy time. Mara never bluffed, which made her more unsettling. Bellic, pass it. Bellic grabbed the phone. Counter battery mission. Grid 1842-6637. 3 tubes. Enemy oriented southwest. Suggested shift, right 31 mils from previous registration. Over. The reply from the battery came with static and a cough of diesel in the line. Received. Charge 4. Be quick. 1 gun adjust. The room waited. Above them, another enemy round landed. Closer. Someone crossed himself. Mara's left hand rested flat on the plot board. It never shook. That was the first thing people noticed about her, if they noticed her at all. Under stress, her hands became more precise. Her blink rate slowed. Her pulse, according to a medic who had checked once out of curiosity, tended to drop instead of rise. It had made the medic uncomfortable. Human beings were not supposed to become calmer when the ceiling started to fall. Mara did not think of it as calm. She thought of it as narrowing. When the first friendly adjust round went out, she felt it through the soles of her boots before the sound reached the bunker. A heavy push from somewhere behind the ridge where the brigade's remaining guns crouched under camouflage netting and prayer. The forward observer on the ridge came back 32 seconds later. Over by 80. Left 2-0. Bellic repeated it. Raiden watched Mara watch nothing at all, her eyes fixed on the paper, as if listening could continue through memory. Second round. Static. Then the observer again, breathless now. Target. Fire for effect. Fire for effect. The battery answered at once. Outside, for gun spoke in sequence, then 4 again. The road kept moving because everyone on it understood enough to fear silence more than noise. Somewhere to the northeast, in darkness nobody could see into, those rounds dropped into a grove of stone sheds where enemy guns had been firing from gaps in the walls. The next barrage, climbing toward the eastern road, never came. Instead came 10 seconds of nothing. Then one far explosion. Then another, smaller, sharper, the sound of ammunition cooking where men had been quick enough to stack shells and too slow to move them. Raiden let out breath he had not meant to hold. Bellic almost laughed, then caught himself because men still screamed outside. The bunker did not cheer. It had been through too much for cheering. But the pitch of fear in the room changed. It became usable. Raiden looked at Mara again, longer this time. You solved with 4 posts. Yes. In under a minute. She glanced at the stopwatch clipped to his sleeve. 54 seconds. Nothing in her face asked for approval. She was already listening for the next problem. What nobody else in the bunker saw was Mara's thumbs slipping beneath her tunic to touch the brass slide rule riding in the inner pocket against her ribs. It had belonged to Colonel Anna Caustic, who had trained half the survey officers still alive in the valley and been cursed by the other half with equal devotion. The slide rule was scarred along one edge where it had struck stone years ago. Wrapped around it was a strip of oilcloth and folded inside, a page torn from Caustic's pocket notebook. Mara had copied the line so many times she no longer needed to unfold it to hear the words. Precision is mercy you can measure. Caustic had written it in slanted pencil beside a firing table stained by rain and thumb grease. Not a motto, not a speech, just a line between numbers, as if philosophy had arrived by accident and stayed because there was space for it. The line made more sense once someone knew the story behind it, and almost no one agreed on that story. Years before Mara wore a uniform, during the winter crossing at Sarek Causeway, Colonel Caustic had been ordered to bring down a bridge with a timed battalion concentration. Enemy armor was already on the far side. Staff wanted the bridge gone. Caustic delayed the fire 97 seconds. 97 seconds in artillery was the width of a life. By the time the rounds hit, the tanks had cleared the span, but so had the ox carts and the women and the children hidden under army tarpaulins. The refugees the enemy had mixed into the crossing as human weather. The bridge fell. The armor escaped. The civilians lived. Some officers called it genius. Some called it betrayal. Caustic lost her promotion anyway. Mara had been 19 when she first read the inquiry file in a damp archive room that smelled of mold and lamp oil. She remembered closing the folder and understanding, for the first time, that exactness alone did not make a person moral. A gun crew could be exact. A murder could be exact. It was the choice inside the correction that mattered. Another shell burst outside, farther west this time. Arranging round. Testing. Mara heard the difference immediately. Not random. Not road. Searching. She turned to Bellick. Move posts 2 and 5 in 20 minutes. 50 meters each. Same mark. Raiden looked over. Why? They're listening back. That got his full attention. He took one step toward her plot table, boots grinding grit. You can know that from 2 salvos. From the interval. First line was road suppression. This line is bracket search. Different discipline. He followed her pencil to the paper and saw what she saw only because she pointed to it. The pauses between hostile rounds. The widening spacing. The slight lateral drift. Someone on the other side was not shelling panic. Someone was calibrating. Move the posts, Raiden said. Bellick was already on it. Outside, the sleet thickened. Trucks resumed, choking forward. The eastern road breathed again. It was a small victory. Just enough to prove what she could do. Just enough to suggest that whatever came next would demand more than speed. What came next arrived before dawn in a field envelope carried by a runner with blood dried under one ear and a smell of diesel soaked so deeply into his coat it entered the bunker before he did. Raiden broke the seal. Read. Read again. Then he looked at Mara in a way he had not before. The Army group wants a forward-ranging section established across the river. Bellick swore under his breath. The river line was broken. Everyone knew it. The enemy had taken a limestone escarpment above Galen Gap 2 days earlier and was dropping observed fire onto every passable road south. The 9th Valley Brigade had one remaining corridor wide enough to move its wounded, its guns and the civilian column trapped behind it. If Galen Gap closed, survival became arithmetic with no kind answer. Mara held out her hand. Raiden gave her the page. The order was short. That made it worse. Enemy counter-battery group designated Black Choir had destroyed 2 guns, 1 fuel dump, 1 surgical station, and 3 road convoys in the last 48 hours. Existing radar was inoperable. A forward acoustic section was required to fix the battery location for a mass time-on-target strike before first light on the next day's planned breakout. Section leader to qualify manually in case of cable loss or power interruption. Failure unacceptable. At the bottom was the signature of Army Group Fire Support. Below that, one handwritten line from someone who knew the valley well enough to remove all illusion. If Black Choir is not silenced, there will be no breakout. Where is the board? Mara asked. Raiden frowned. What board? The qualification board. That was the first moment he stopped mistaking her quiet for fragility. The test took place in a school gymnasium because the original survey hall had lost its roof in spring and nobody had repaired it. The floor still showed faded boundary lines beneath tracked mud. Sandbags covered the lower windows. At one end, a chalkboard leaned against stacked benches under a portrait that had survived 3 governments and 1 direct hit only because the shell had entered through the opposite wall. Kerosene heaters made the room smell of dust and hot metal. Outside, guns rolled like doors slamming somewhere under the hills. 3 tables stood under lamps. On the first lay a surveyed baseline chart with 6 microphone positions marked to the meter. On the second, a stack of simulated trace strips with recorded arrival time differences from previous battery fires. On the third, meteorological corrections. Temperature, wind, pressure, inversion warnings, all the invisible things that made sound lie unless you argued with it properly. 2 senior captains from Army Group observe in silence. Raiden stood near the door, arms folded. A stopwatch hung from Captain Dren's wrist. Scenario 1, Dren announced. 3 hostile guns. For functioning posts. Temperature -3. Crosswind 8 meters per second from 080. Manual solve only. 90 seconds. Mara stepped to the board. No speech. No performance. She picked up the grease pencil and touched the slide rule through her tunic once. Not for luck, but for sequence. Hands, bore mind. Always the same order. Drin slapped the tray strip down. Begin. The room narrowed. She marked time differences first. Then chose the central pairs least distorted by wind drift. Corrected for cold air and inversion. Rejected one outlier because the delay spacing suggested shell passage noise contaminating the post, not clean muzzle blast. Wrote the probable corridor. Crossed it with the second solution. Then the third. Not a point yet. A lens. Tighten the lens. Use asymptotes. Accept nothing you cannot explain. Her eyes stopped blinking. Drin noticed it by the second scenario and began to look uneasy. 40 seconds, he called. She ignored him. The pencil made a dry ticking sound on the waxed overlay. She solved. Grid 2134-7081. Orientation south by southwest. Error, radius 55 meters. Drin checked the answer key. His brows rose before he hit it. 51 seconds. Scenario 2 introduced a severed post and conflicting meteorological data. Scenario 3 simulated a moving battery attempting shoot and scoot displacement between salvos. Scenario 4 removed power from the recorder entirely and required reconstruction from raw interval notes called aloud by 3 operators at once. The room grew warmer. Men loosened collars. One heater coughed black smoke. Mara never hurried. That was the unusual part, not the speed. Plenty of officers moved fast. Mara refused speed as a feeling. She let it emerge as a consequence of order. Her stillness did not mean indecision. It meant she would not donate one extra motion to chaos. On the third scenario, a young lieutenant from Army Group shifted impatiently and murmured to his neighbor, "She's going to miss the displacement." Raiden heard him. So did Mara. She adjusted the likely movement lane by 70 meters based on wheel spacing from the previous site, the nearest hard ground, and the fact that crews under counter-battery pressure almost always chose one clean exit rather than the clever one. When Drin checked the key, the lieutenant at the wall stopped whispering. "What gave you the lane?" Drin asked. "The battery commander was trained properly," Mara answered. That drew a quiet reaction because everyone in the room knew there was only one enemy commander in the sector spoken about that way. Black Choir. Captain Luca Burin. The file on Burin was already on the table when Drin pushed the final scenario toward her. Grainy photograph. Profile only. One hand on a map case. Collar up. Old intelligence sheet clipped behind it. 31. Survey School honors. Former protege of Colonel Anacostic. Former captain in the Valley Army. Court-martialed after a friendly fire catastrophe at Mount Rizzle. Sentence suspended. Disappeared in transfer. Reappeared 6 months later on the other side of the line. Credited with reorganizing enemy counter-battery drills around acoustic deception, false registration intervals, and rapid displacement timed against expected radar response. At the bottom lay a translated intercept from 3 nights earlier. Measure the road, then close it. He had taken Caustic's language and hollowed it out until only cruelty fit inside. There was more. A copied carbon memo from the year Caustic died. Survey base compromised before dawn strike. Post locations known to hostile artillery with impossible accuracy. Cause unresolved. Unresolved. Mara saw 3 handwritten initials at the edge. IH. Major Evo Halden. Forgettable by design. Meteorology and logistics coordination. Clean cuffs when everyone else wore mud. The kind of officer who looked like paper. Men like Halden never appeared in heroics because they did not look like fate. They looked like filing systems. Dren removed the file. Your mission assumption? Mara set down the pencil. Burin will mask his true battery with decoys and displace after the second volley. Not the first, because he expects radar to be blind and acoustic teams to overcommit to the opening line. And your concern? He knows how we solve because he learned where I learned. Raiden broke the silence. Will you still go? Mara looked at the copied memo, still half visible under Dren's hand. All at once the formal mission and something older slid toward each other. If the baseline is good, she said, I will find him. Luca Burin's grievance was large enough to wound loyalty. At Mount Rizzle, 14 infantry died under friendly rounds because the meteorological correction passed to his fire direction section was false. Not imperfect. False. Wind layer, temperature gradient, density altitude. Wrong in a way no careful officer should have accepted. Yet the sheet arrived signed, stamped, urgent. Luca trusted the process. The rounds drifted 212 meters. Men died in friendly uniforms. Command needed an answer before the funerals cooled. The answer they chose was Luca. Court-martial. Public censure. Transfer. No serious inquiry into the source sheet. Caustic fought it. Then Caustic died when her survey base was struck with impossible precision weeks later. After that, nobody important wanted the story reopened. A dead mentor, a disgraced student, a file marked unresolved. Systems love neat endings more than true ones. Luca crossed the line 6 months later. Understandable. Inexcusable. That was the kind of contradiction war manufactured in bulk. By evening, the mission order was final. Mara would lead a 6-person acoustic section across the river under escort from a reduced infantry platoon. They would emplace 4 primary microphones and 2 backup listening posts along a shallow crescent beneath the limestone escarpment north of Galen Gap. Once Mara provided a confirmed grid, every available brigade tube would fire simultaneously. High explosive quick on the initial strike, delay on the second, 3 volleys, then immediate shift if the battery attempted to move. Before departure, Raiden found Mara outside the bunker, checking cable coils. The air tasted of snow and diesel. Somewhere beyond the trees, mechanics were trying to wake an engine with curses, ether, and a length of chain. "You know why I hesitated," he said. "Yes. Say it. You thought a survey lieutenant belonged behind the line. And you thought talent on paper is not the same as talent under shelling. That second part was not unreasonable." No, that answer pleased him more than agreement would have. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded page. Caustic's dissent statement after Sarah Causeway. 3 paragraphs. Signed in blue-black ink. This copy bore a margin note Mara had never seen before. A bridge is wood, steel, and geometry. A column is not. Never confuse the target with what passes across it. "I kept that," Raiden said, because men kept calling her weak for 97 seconds of mercy. Then half the ones she saved outlived the war, and their accusers did not. Mara folded the page with the slide rule. "Thank you." He glanced toward the dark river. "If this fails, there won't be much left to accuse anyone of." She nodded. There was no speech before departure. Just the old routine of equipment checked by touch, because batteries died, of rifle bolts pulled once then eased forward, of tape wrapped around buckles to kill shine. Mara inspected every cable spool, every coupler, every post number. She verified the quartz timer against brigade time. She checked the backup field phone and the grease pencils. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "What is the wind on the escarpment?" Bellick answered from the weather chit. 9 meters per second, variable. Falling temperature. Inversion likely until sunrise. Mara nodded. "Then we have 1 clean window." And she started walking. The river crossing smelled of silt and cold iron. The pontoon bridge flexed under boots and mule carts, every plank wrapped in wet canvas to muffle the sound. Below, black water struck the supports in slow hollow knocks. No one spoke above a murmur. Halfway across, Mara unfolded the old compromise memo again. Survey base, compromised before dawn strike. Cause unresolved. The initials at the edge were still there. IH. A pattern moved through her mind. False meteorological sheets at Mount Rizzle. Caustic's base struck with impossible precision. Current post relocations guessed too quickly by the enemy. Weather summaries passed through Halden's desk before they reached survey and fire direction. The official mission remained the same. Find Black Choir before dawn. But now there was another objective buried inside it like a live fuse. Find who had killed Caustic. And if the same man was still feeding numbers across the line, stop him before the breakout rolled into a prepared grave. The far bank rose in a scrub and broken limestone shelves. The platoon escort led them north through a drainage cut where stale snow held the smell of old smoke. Each post weighed little by itself, but the batteries cable, and recorder made the load ugly rather than heavy. Mara took her share without asking. Private Orsic, youngest in the platoon, glanced back when she lifted the second cable spool over a fallen olive trunk. "You can leave that." "I've got it." "No," Mara said. He stared at her and kept moving. The night approach tested them by inches, not heroics. Mud that held boots half a second too long. Thorn scrub catching cable jackets. Stone so cold through gloves it made fingers stupid. Twice they flattened while enemy flares went up over the road below, washing the limestone white as bone. The men smelled of damp wool, gun oil, and the sharp metallic note sweat took on in winter when fear ran close. They reached the first emplacement on a reverse slope just after midnight. Mara knelt, pressed 2 fingers to the soil. Wind from the east. Hard pan under thin thaw. She adjusted the plan stake spacing by 3 meters. "Post 1 here," she breathed. Angle the cable low. No loops. The second post went into a scrub line. The third near a shattered cistern wall. The fourth farther east than Mara liked because the ground between was open and she did not trust the moonless depression beyond it. But geometry required curve, not comfort. Halfway to the fourth post, Mara stopped so abruptly Bellick nearly walked into her. "What?" She raised one hand. Nothing visible had changed, but the night had shifted shape. Danger often announced itself by subtraction. The ordinary argument of wind and distance thinned. Then, under it, came a low padded concussion too far away to be impact and too soft to be thunder. Registration. Enemy mortars preparing a line. "Down," she whispered. No one moved. "Down." Training beat confusion by half a second. Men dropped. Cable coils thudded into scrub. Mara was still pulling Orsic by the webbing when the first rounds came in 50 meters ahead, walking the exact path they would have taken had they kept moving. Earth leaped. Stone sprayed. A second line crashed behind them. Orsic stared at the blasted path and then at Mara with the shock of a man who had just watched the next version of himself die instead. "How did you?" "Propellant echo," she said. That was not the whole answer, but it was enough. They lay still while the mortar line passed and shifted west. When the impacts ended, the platoon lieutenant crawled over, face chalked by limestone dust. "We keep going." Mara looked at the sky through thorn branches. Clouds were thickening from the southwest. If the front arrived early, the inversion would collapse and acoustic bearings would smear. The breakout below the escarpment was scheduled before dawn. That gave them, at best, a shrinking window to establish, listen, solve, transmit, and survive. She checked the luminous dial taped inside her sleeve. 103 minutes. "That is our window," she said. After that sound binge wrong. There was the countdown. At 89 minutes remaining, they placed the fourth post. At 82, Mara confirmed continuity on 3 primary posts and 1 backup. At 76, the field phone line to brigade command crackled alive. At 73, Bellick reported the second backup, noisy from windwash. Mara accepted it. Perfection had left the valley weeks ago. At 68 minutes, the first decoy guns fired. Even before the traces completed, Mara knew they were false. Too clean, too theatrical. The intervals were almost textbook, a battery commander displaying competence for an audience he knew was listening. Real crews under pressure were never so symmetrical. "These are decoys," she said. Bellick frowned. "How can you be sure?" "The battery wants us to be impressed." 10 seconds later, a second set of blasts rolled in from farther west, dirtier, staggered, partially masked by terrain. 3 posts caught them clean. The fourth lagged. That was enough. Black choir. Mara marked the time differences. "Not yet," she murmured. 1 more volley needed. Maybe 2. But Luca would know that too. He would fire just enough to provoke a solution, then jump lanes before counterbattery landed. The field phone buzzed. "Raiden. Report. 2 lines. 1 false. Real battery still masked. Need another volley." "How long?" Mara looked at the dial. 61 minutes. Before the front turns. He understood. Breakout convoys begin moving in 47. That meant the road would be full before the window closed. "Put Major Halden on the command loop," Mara said. A pause. "What?" Tell him I need updated escarpment wind layers for correction. Another pause. Shorter this time, because Raiden had stopped treating her requests as random. Stand by. The line clicked. Major Halden. Soft. Polite. Forgettable. Mara kept her tone flat. Need updated wind layers from the escarpment down to the road. 10-meter bands. I sent the standard summary 2 hours ago. I need the uncut sheet. Static breathed between them. Then Halden, almost indulgent. That level of detail is not useful in the field, Lieutenant. It is tonight. Paper movement. Time buying. Or pretending. How soon? Halden asked. Immediately. Read it for the log. That was one of Caustic's habits. Read it for the log. Numbers first. Let people condemn themselves with accuracy. Halden sighed once. Very well. He began reading wind bands. They were plausible. Too plausible. But when he reached the inversion depth, Mara's pencil stopped. Wrong. Not by much. By just enough to drag a rushed acoustic solution westward into empty ground and waste the opening volley. A careful lie. Repeat the inversion depth, Mara said. A beat. 300 meters. She had expected that. The actual figure from the portable mast below the ridge had been 182. Thank you, she said. Halden almost relaxed. It came through the line as warmth. Anything else? Yes. Stay near the phone. At 54 minutes, Black Choir fired again. This time Mara caught a truer signature because Luca had shifted from artistry to urgency. The real battery revealed itself through necessity. 3 heavy guns in shallow stagger behind the false line, likely 152s by the depth and spread of the muzzle blast, using a hidden eastward exit track. She plotted, corrected for the true inversion depth, crossed the lens, tightened it. Grid emerged. Not complete. Almost. Then the 4th post died. The trace went flat. Bellick slapped the housing. Cable cut. Can you restore? Not before the next volley. Below them, faint through the dark, engines began to turn over on the breakout road. Everything changed. Raiden made the decision to move the wounded first because wounded men could not run when artillery came. It was not moral theory. It was vehicle mathematics. If the lead trucks jammed with civilians and stalled under shelling, the ambulances behind would burn in place. The recorder pit was little more than a scraped hollow roof with camouflage net and 3 broken orchard doors. It smelled of damp canvas, battery acid, and wet limestone. Another decoy line west, Bellick said. He's thickening the mask. Ignore admiration, Mara said. Solve need. Luca wanted the breakout road. He wanted the vehicles as they entered the narrowest section under the escarpment where reversing would be impossible. He would keep just enough distance to stay outside direct fire harassment, close enough for observed correction, near enough to a lateral track for shoot and scoot. A memory rose from survey school. Luca at the farboard, years before betrayal, explaining to exhausted cadets why the best battery sites were never the prettiest on a map. Guns are lazy in the same way water is lazy, he had said, almost smiling over chalk dust. They prefer the ground that already wants to carry them somewhere else. Caustic had overheard him. That's good, she had murmured. Keep that line. Just don't become the kind of officer who thinks lazy ground makes moral decisions for him. Back then, Luca had laughed. Now Mara used his own thinking against him. There was one exit track east of the false orchard line that sloped behind a quarry spoil mound and rejoined the old lime road in 300 meters. Hard enough ground for towing. Concealed enough for a practice crew. Close enough to the road to fire and shift before heavy counterbattery landed. She marked it. Bellick saw the pencil stroke. You're solving where he'll be, not where he is. Both. That's a guess. No, it is a habit with numbers attached. The field phone crackled. Raiden again, voice tighter now. Behind him, engines shouted convoy counts, somebody cursing about axle spacing. Status. I have the battery and the exit lane. Confidence. 72%. Silence. Then a new voice. Brigadier Sola. Army Group Liaison, clipped and impatient. Lieutenant, you cannot have battalion mass on 72. Mara's expression did not change. Nothing in artillery is 100. Then give me certainty. She changed the question. Who authorized Major Halden's inversion sheet? Silence again. Even Bellick looked over. Sola's voice hardened. What does that have to do with the current mission? It is wrong. Then correct it and proceed. I already did. Raiden heard the real sentence underneath. So did Halden, if he was still on a monitored loop. Open brigade net, Mara said. Halden too. Sola started to object. Raiden did not ask why. Do it. At 32 minutes, the storm front touched the far ridge. Mara heard it before the wind changed. A mast hiss through bare branches. The inversion would not survive long. Black Choir fired. Not decoys now. Real guns. All three. The breakout road below them flashed white under impact. Too soon. Luca had chosen to strike before the column fully entered the kill section. Either he sensed time running out, or he had already been warned that the brigade was nearly ready to move. Halden. The three traces leaped across the smoke paper. Mara bent over them. Post 1 clean. Post 3 clean. Backup noisy but usable. Wind beginning to shear. She corrected mentally now, too fast for full notation, using the true inversion depth, the altered temperature drop, the expected refraction off the quarry face. The grid converged. There. She drew a hard circle around the coordinate. Then a second, farther east, on the exit track. But first came the second mission. Major Halden, she said into the now open brigade net. Read the inversion depth again. For the whole brigade. What is this? Halden asked, still polite, though the edges had tightened. Read it. Brigadier Sola cut in, furious. Lieutenant, you are out of line. Mara ignored him. Halden said, 300 meters. Mara spoke into the shared net so every driver, gunner, medic, and clerk within range could hear. The actual field mast reading was 182. Your correction would pull our strike west into dead ground. This is the third false weather sheet tied to your office. Mount Ruzel was one. Colonel Caustic's base was another. The net became pure breath and static. Halden tried indignation first. That is an outrageous accusation. Mara went on, not louder, which made it worse. Your initials are on the compromise memo from Caustic's last base. You revised tonight's inversion after the mast note left the escarpment. You asked me how soon the correction was needed before giving the wrong depth. Raiden's voice entered like a blade laid flat on a table. Major Halden, answer. There are moments when ordinary evil becomes visible. Not dramatic, just visible. When Halden answered, there was a crack in his voice that made him sound suddenly older. You don't understand, he said. None of you understand how these decisions are made. Mara held the transmitter closer, then explained them. That was the weapon, not rank. Precision. My son needed treatment, Halden said. Do you hear me? My son needed medicine and passage papers. They offered transport. They offered names on the list. Do you know what a list costs in this war? No one interrupted. They asked for weather sheets, road timings, old base maps. Nothing that should have mattered if your precious commanders moved when they said they would. Nothing that should have killed anyone if the right people had done their jobs. Bellick shut his eyes. Mara said Caustic died. Halden's next words nearly carried regret. Nearly. She was not supposed to be there that morning. There it was. Near humanity. Too late. Raiden's voice came back, colder now than anger. Major Halden, remain where you are. Military police. Mara passed the phone to Bellick. Now. He transmitted the coordinates in one breath. Counter battery target ready. Grid 2141, 7093. Secondary displacement lane, east to 2148, 7091. Battalion time on target. Initial heat quick. Follow with delay. Danger close eastern road margin 58 if convoy breaks line. Repeat, danger close. Raiden answered at once. Mission accepted. What followed happened too fast for memory to remain smooth. The brigade guns were scattered survivors hidden in folds of ground and ruined farmyards. But once the order reached them, each tube entered the same old mechanical prayer. Shell, charge, fuse, deflection, quadrant, ram, close, lay, fire. Batteries that had not spoken together in days calculated time of flight to the second so that rounds from different ranges would arrive together. Luca fired again. The road flashed again. Mara grabbed the second transmitter and climbed out of the pit. "Where are you going?" Bellick shouted. "To see the lane." It took 11 seconds. 11 seconds from recorder pit to the rock lip above the road. 11 seconds across wet limestone, one slide, one cut palm, one breath held under fragment hiss. 11 seconds between the first impossible act and the harder one. From the lip, she could see it. The breakout column bunching too tightly. The lead surgical trucks clear. The fuel wagon slowing. 2 civilian carts broken sideways. If Black Choir displaced east as she predicted, the second enemy correction would fall directly where the road narrowed and the stalled carts trapped everything behind them. The first impossible act was finding the battery. The second was killing where it would move before it moved, while keeping the road alive. Short sentences now. Wind rising. Road jammed. Enemies shifting. Friendly rounds inbound. Mara keyed the net. Raiden. Shift convoy left shoulder. 20 meters. Now. What? Second pattern. Confirm. Yes. Below, drivers began swinging wheels toward the ditch line. Men jumped from carts. Mules screamed. Then a voice entered the net she had not heard in years and recognized instantly. Luca Burin. Calm. Almost curious. "You were always the faster one, Mara." Bellick looked up from the pit, like he had heard a ghost. Luca continued, his voice clipped by static and distance. "I wondered which of us she taught better." Mara said nothing. The 1st Brigade salvo landed. The escarpment became light. 3 flashes inside the orchard line. Then one deeper, larger, the real ammunition stack going up. Stone and timber rose in black pieces against white blast. Half a breath later, the delay fuse volley tore into the eastward exit track and folded it under falling earth. But one enemy gun had already hooked north. Mara saw the movement as much as heard it, a dark dragged shape on the lime road, seeking one last firing angle on the bunch convoy. Harder act. No time for debate. She keyed the net again. Immediate shift. Secondary lane. All guns. Fire. Sola shouted something about confirmation. Raiden overrode him with one sentence. Fire the lane. The 2nd Brigade strike came in while the moving gun was still turning. 3 rounds short. 2 dead on line. 1 through the prime mover. The road below vanished in dust. Then nothing. No correction from Black Choir. No next line. No third volley walking onto the convoy. Only the long, falling hiss of dirt and fragments returning to earth. Silence followed, and an artillery silence was never empty. It was evidence. Mara stayed on one knee at the rock lip, palm bleeding on a limestone, eyes still fixed on the road because survival often took a moment to reveal itself. Then engines started again. 1, then 3, then many. The convoy moved. Not neatly, not bravely, just forward, which was enough. Behind her, Bellick laughed once in disbelief and had to cover his mouth like a man in church. Raiden's voice came over the net, quiet now, almost intimate with exhaustion. "You gave us 58 meters." Mara did not answer. He added, "After a beat, that was enough." Later, when teams searched the shattered battery site, they found 2 destroyed guns, 1 overturned prime mover, 3 dead crews, and a burned signal truck with its radio fused into black metal. They did not find Luca Burin's body. War often refused neat endings. But they did find a map case half-charred to the latch. Inside were firing tables, a greased pencil, and 1 torn page in Colonel Caustic's handwriting. "Precision is mercy you can measure." Beneath it, in Luca's tighter script, 1 final line. "She taught you the part 1 refused to learn." That was his last communication. It acknowledged her superiority without surrendering dignity, which was fitting. Luca had never lacked intelligence, only wisdom. The 9th Valley Brigade crossed Galen Gap before dawn. Wounded first, fuel second, guns third, civilians wherever space opened. By afternoon, they were beyond the escarpment. 3 days later, the ceasefire held long enough to be called real. Men who would have died on the road instead lived to complain about rations, infection, and bad blankets, which was another way of saying they had survived the war. 3 months later, the classroom smelled of chalk dust, warm wiring, and coffee fresh enough to count as luxury. No shells shook the windows. No diesel burned under panic. The hills beyond the training range were green again in patches, though not enough to pretend nothing had happened there. Mara stood at the front beside a demonstration board, showing a curved baseline and 4 microphone posts marked in red pencil. Her left palm had healed into a thin, pale seam. The brass slide rule still rode in her inner pocket. She touched it sometimes between lessons, not for comfort, but for continuity. The students were young enough to believe expertise came from formulas alone. That was useful because it meant they could still be corrected before war taught them worse. One cadet stumbled through a manual solve and looked frustrated when his bearing lines produced a sloppy lens instead of a clean point. "You are rushing the silence," Mara said. He blinked. The silence. The space between arrivals. That is where the truth is. A few of them smiled uncertainly, writing it down because they did not yet know whether she was being technical or philosophical. She let them work another minute, then set the pencil down. For most of the war, she said, people asked the wrong question about artillery. They asked whether skill was enough. Whether if you could hit precisely, that alone made the weapon justified. It is not. Skill decides whether you can hit. Wisdom decides whether you should, and what you refuse to hit even when someone orders it. That was the first time she had ever stated the central question plainly. The room quieted. One cadet in the second row, a thin girl with ink on the side of her hand, lifted her head. "How did you know where the guns were when no one could see them?" It was the same question the story had carried from the opening. Mara almost smiled. She took the folded page from Caustic's oilcloth, opened it, and set on the desk where the students could see the old pencil line. "Colonel Caustic wrote this," Mara said. "Precision is mercy you can measure." The cadets waited. Mara looked past them, out the window, to the far training hill where the listening posts were set among grass and stone in clean weather instead of fear. "It does not mean gentleness," she said. "It means numbers are never innocent by themselves. If you can place a round within 40 meters, or 10, or 1, then every meter you choose becomes a moral act." Caustic delayed a bridge strike 97 seconds so civilians could clear. Men called that weakness because they confused obedience with strength. Luca Burin learned all of her mathematics and none of her restraint. He became brilliant at finding targets and useless at recognizing what passed through them. That is how skill becomes cruelty. The ink-handed cadet asked, "So what did you hear that night?" Mara considered the question. "Discipline," she said. "Habit." Lies that were too careful. A man tried to impress the listener with decoys. Another man trying to bend numbers just enough to kill people from a desk. And underneath all of it, the same thing Colonel Caustic taught. Never confuse the target with what passes across it. She tapped the page once. That is what the line means. Mercy is not softness. Mercy is exactness guided by judgment. It is knowing what your numbers touch. No one wrote for several seconds. They were old enough, then, to understand that some lessons had to land before they could be copied. At the end of class, Mara took them outside to the training field. The afternoon was still. A technician downrange triggered the sound source. 3 controlled detonators, staggered by calibrated intervals. The students leaned into their earphones, clumsy at first, trying to separate arrival from echo, muzzle blast from reflected slap. Mara listened too. The opening action returned in a peaceful form. Not survival now. Mastery. She marked the first arrival, then the second, then the third. Calm hands. Slowed blink. Measure breath. The same motion she had made in the bunker while the road was dying, now done under sun and birdsong and the smell of cut grass. A student beside her frowned at his board. "My line drifts west." "Because you trusted the loudest post," Mara said. "Trust the cleanest one." He corrected. The lens tightened. His face changed when he saw it. That was how legacies were restored. Not by monuments. By transmission. As the class packed up, the wind shifted over the hills and carried a distant roll from another training battery beyond the valley. For a moment, it sounded enough like the old war to make the youngest cadets glance up. Mara did not. She simply folded Caustic's page, returned it to the oilcloth, and looked once toward the far ridge where clouds were building in a line too straight to ignore. There was always another line forming somewhere. She rested 2 fingers over the slide rule in her pocket and spoke so softly only the nearest students heard. "Measure carefully," she said. "Mercy is always smaller than it looks." The students drifted back toward the barracks in pairs, still arguing over bearings and arrival times, still carrying their notebooks open as if the equations might escape if they closed the covers too quickly. Mara remained by the field board a little longer, not because she needed to, but because silence after instruction was the only way to tell whether a lesson had landed deeply enough to change someone later under pressure. Wind moved through the grass in low bands. Far off, another training battery reported with 2 deliberate rounds, then stopped. The sound crossed the hills cleanly. Bellick found her there with a brown envelope tucked under one arm and the expression of a man who had learned that peace created paperwork the way war created graves. "They want signatures," he said. "Who does?" "Everyone who survives long enough to need a record." He handed her the envelope. It carried the tribunal seal from the provisional capital. Inside were deposition copies, inventory lists, and the first formal summary of Major Evo Halden's confession. The language was colder than the event itself had been. It called his actions unauthorized disclosures of meteorological and movement data to enemy intermediaries in exchange for medical transport promises for a dependent child. It called Colonel Anacostic's death a secondary consequence of compromised survey coordinates. It called Mount Ruzel a preventable fire control catastrophe exacerbated by false environmental inputs. Official phrasing always tried to make blood dry faster. Mara read to the last page. There, paper-clipped separately, sat the thing Bellick had known would matter more than all the legal language above it. A storage ledger, recovered from Halden's office. 3 sealed cartons, never delivered to archives. 2 had been opened by investigators. 1 was still missing. What was in the missing one? Mara asked. Bellick looked toward the hills before answering. "Field notebooks. Survey overlays. Caustic's name appears on the transfer line." Mara felt nothing dramatic. No visible reaction. Only the quiet internal shift she always felt when a pattern gained one more confirming number. "Lost." "Not officially." Bellick's mouth tightened. "Ms. Routed during evacuation. That's what they're calling it." "Who signed the movement?" Bellick tapped the second page. "Halden. Then somebody else after the collapse in the Capitol. Name redacted." "Why redacted?" "Because peace still has cowards." He said it without bitterness. Just tired recognition. Mara slid the pages back into the envelope. Where was the box going? "A survey depot near Vesh Ridge. The one that burned." "Burned completely?" Bellick gave her a look that meant he had hoped she would not ask the precise question first. Enough that people stopped looking. Not enough that everything vanished. The late sun broke briefly through a line of thin cloud and caught the brass edge of the slide rule beneath her coat. Bellick saw the flash. "I thought you'd want to know before the tribunal men turned it into months of inventory language," he said. "You were right." He waited a moment. "There's more." "There usually is." He pulled a folded radio intercept from the back of the envelope. The paper was new. The copy stamp was fresh. This was not tribunal material. This was active. Single source report from Northern Monitoring Station. Unconfirmed hostile voice transmission picked up during cross-border smuggling traffic. Fragment only. Technical references included counterbattery, decoy registration, and old survey call signs no civilian would know. One phrase underlined by intelligence staff. "She still listens before the second echo." Bellick watched Mara read it. "Could be imitation." "No," Mara said. "You're certain?" "Yes." He did not ask how. He had worked with her long enough to know that certainty in Mara was never mystical. It was always cumulative. A voice pattern, a technical phrase, the shape of an insult. Luca Burin used precision the way other men used a signature. Bellick rubbed his jaw. The official line is that black choir ceased to exist after Galen Gap. Official lines survive longer than facts. "You think he made it out?" Mara folded the intercept once and tucked it into the envelope. "I think he planned for failure because he expected to need a second design." Bellick said nothing to that. The training ground had emptied now. Somewhere beyond the sheds, a truck backfired. and 3 cadets flinched in practiced embarrassment. Mara watched them without smiling. "Who else has seen this?" she asked. "Raiden. And he told me to give it to you before anyone in the capital decided to solve it with committees." That sounded like him. Raiden arrived after dusk smelling of rain and horse leather, though he had come by truck. The years had taught his coat to hold onto older forms of transport, the way old soldiers held onto dead friends and fragments of posture and speech. He entered Mara's office without knocking because he had never once knocked in his life and saw no reason peace should begin now. The office had once been a bookkeeping room. It still had narrow shelves, one warped window, and the faded outline of a portrait removed before the last retreat. Mara kept maps on the wall, notebooks stacked flat, and one chipped enamel cup for coffee she drank cold often enough that fresh heat now felt almost ceremonial. The room carried the smell of paper, chalk, damp wood, and the faint mineral bite of limestone dust from the training field. Raiden closed the door behind him and leaned both hands on the desk. "You read it?" "Yes. And there are at least 2 questions. I expected more than that." Mara looked up from the intercept. "The first is whether Lucas survived." Raiden nodded once. "The second," she said, "is why someone is moving Caustic's notebooks now." Raiden dragged a chair back, but did not sit immediately. "The tribunal wants Halden tied up cleanly. 1 confession, 1 compromised network, 1 dead enemy battery commander, 1 restored chain of legitimacy." People are hungry for neat conclusions. Conclusions are usually neat because they omit transport. That almost made him laugh. He sat. "The depot at Vesh Ridge wasn't random," he said. "It was a survey archive annex before the shelling. Old sound ranging records, meteorological tables, calibration notebooks. The sort of place no politician visits because the shelves cannot applaud. Who asked for Caustic's material moved there? Halden signed the first transfer. After that, records become fog." Mara rested the edge of the envelope against the desk. Then either he wanted them hidden, or somebody wanted them accessible. Or both. Raiden studied her for a moment. "You understand what I'm about to say, so I'll save us both politeness. If Burin is alive, and those notebooks still exist, they are not sentimental artifacts. They're doctrine. They contain everything Caustic learned that she never published because she was too busy staying alive to organize it for men who only liked her after she was dead." Mara said nothing. Raiden continued. "There are officers in the capital who want those notebooks because they think legacy can be restored by display case. There are men across the border who would want them because anything precise can be turned into weapon doctrine. And there are smugglers who would move them for whatever currency survives this month." He finally leaned back. "I have no authority to order what I'm thinking. That has never stopped you from thinking it." This time he did laugh, briefly. "No, it hasn't." Rain began against the warped window in small, fast taps. Raiden slid a map tube onto the desk. "Vesh Ridge sits inside the provisional demarcation zone. Not strictly ours. Not fully theirs. Patrols move through when convenient. So do everyone else's ghosts." Mara opened the tube and unrolled the map. The old depot lay tucked beneath a spur road above a dry quarry and a collapsed telegraph line. 2 access cuts. 1 service track, half washed out. 1 drainage tunnel from pre-war storage expansion. Enough routes for trouble. Enough concealment for anyone who understood logistics better than politics. "Who do you trust for a team?" Raiden asked. She looked at the contour lines, then at him. "Bellic. Already assumed. 2 engineers who can read old cable layouts. 1 medic. 1 driver who does not narrate fear." Raiden nodded. "And no more than 1 young officer who still thinks rules are the same as judgment." Now he smiled properly. "I can find you that exact proportion. You already have." He reached into his inside pocket and passed her a folded movement authorization, pre-signed but undated. "Officially, this is an educational recovery mission to retrieve calibration equipment from a damaged survey annex. Unofficially, if you encounter proof Burin is alive, you never discussed it on paper with me." She glanced over the sheet. "Who signed this?" "A man in the capital who owes me for not repeating something he said drunk in winter." Mara placed the authorization under the envelope. When do we leave? Before dawn. That answer pleased her more than any formal permission would have. The convoy was small enough not to look important, which was the only kind of convoy worth trusting in uncertain territory. One truck with a canvas back and side benches polished smooth by too many wet uniforms. One utility vehicle carrying engineer crates, cable test sets, spades, bolt cutters, and more optimism than the equipment justified. 6 rifles. 2 submachine guns. 1 medical satchel smelling faintly of iodine and stale leather. Rain during the night had turned the road to the color and consistency of old mortar paste. The young officer Raiden selected introduced himself as Lieutenant Nico Sermet with the careful stiffness of someone who wanted to prove seriousness before competence had enough history to do it for him. He was 24, clean-shaven, bright-eyed in a way that suggested he had not yet had enough sleep removed from him to understand what exhaustion did to men's moral certainty. He carried regulation properly. He asked permission before touching maps. Mara distrusted him immediately for all the reasonable reasons and none of the petty ones. Sir said, "I'd learn from you," he told her as the truck jolted north. That depends on what you listen to. He thought about that longer than most would have. Good sign. Bellick rode opposite them with the engineer crates at his feet and pretended not to listen. The 2 engineers, Petter and Ilsa, were older than the lieutenant and younger than Caution. They talked in low practical bursts about cable jackets and damp insulation. The medic, Sanaa, slept sitting upright for the first hour with one hand still looped through the strap of her satchel, a skill only field medicine seemed to teach. The driver never turned around. Mara liked him immediately. By mid-morning the hills narrowed, and the road gave up pretending to be maintained. Burned farm walls passed in broken rows. Orchard terraces sagged into weed and shale. Once they overtook a mule cart carrying 2 doors, 1 mattress, and a cracked mirror in which the truck's own cab flashed and vanished like a second vehicle fleeing in reverse. War ended on documents before it ended in landscapes. The earth kept its own slower archive. Sermet unfolded the map on his knees. The depot was hit from the south. Mara looked over. Likely. Why? He traced the contour lines. Because if someone wanted to remove boxes after the strike, they'd avoid the main service entrance. 2 exposed from the road. Bellick lifted his eyes without moving his head. You can think. That helps. The lieutenant accepted the remark without pride. Better sign. Mara pointed to the drainage tunnel marked in faded blue pencil. Storage expansions before the second winter. Survey annexes liked dry lower channels for cable spools and paper stock. If the main building burned, the lower tunnel may have survived. Sermet frowned. And if Burin knows that too, he would. The truck hit a rut hard enough to knock one engineer's cap into Sanaa's lap. Nobody laughed. The weather had turned thin and bright, the sort of clear noon that often came after hard rain and made damaged ground look briefly honest. Bellick tapped the envelope at Mara's side. You still think the notebooks matter to him personally? Yes. Because of Caustic. Because of what he needed from her, Mara said. Sermet glanced up. Permission to ask something? Mara nodded. Why do brilliant men betray better than mediocre men? Bellick snorted softly, but Mara answered. Because brilliance gives shape to resentment. A mediocre traitor steals access. A brilliant one redesigns trust so that betrayal can move through it without friction. Sermet looked back at the map and grew quieter after that. They left the vehicles under camouflaged netting in a cut below the ridge and walked the last kilometer because engines carried too far in clear weather. The depot appeared only when the path turned sharply east and the spur opened above the quarry. Tom had taken its piece, but not all of it. The main warehouse roof had collapsed inward on one side, leaving blackened trusses like broken ribs. A side office block still stood in partial ruin with 2 windows punched out and one corner split down to the foundation. The telegraph line lay snapped across scrub, porcelain insulators scattered like teeth. Grass had begun taking the yard back. Peace always arrived first as vegetation. Sanaa crouched by the old loading platform. No fresh vehicle tracks. Too much rain, Ilsa murmured. Fresh foot traffic? Mara asked. Sanaa touched the mud, studied the edge, then pointed toward the side of the office block. Something moved there within a day. Not many. 2, maybe 3. Bellick had already lifted binoculars. No sentry. That only means no sentry visible, Mara said. They split by pairs. Mara took Sermet because teaching under uncertainty revealed more than classrooms ever could. Bellick and Petter circled toward the side door. Ilsa and Sanaa moved wide to cover the yard and drainage cut. Inside, the office block smelled of soaked ash, mildew, and mouse nests. Shelving had fallen sideways in one room. Burned paper clung in black scales to a wall. A rusted filing cabinet stood open, one drawer half torn from its runners. Sermet moved carefully, muzzle low, eyes trying to be everywhere at once. Mara watched not his weapon, but his feet. Young officers announced fear through speed below the knees long before their voices betrayed it. "Slow down," she said. "I'm not moving fast. You are thinking fast. Your boots are following." He exhaled once and corrected. "Good. Teachable." They found the first sign in the records room at the rear. 3 empty transport crates, newer than anything else inside, stenciled with medical supply markings too clean for the ruin around them. False labels. Bellick appeared at the doorway a moment later, holding up a strip of wax packing paper. "Used last week," he said. "Still smells of oilskin." Mara knelt by the crate corners. Fresh prime marks. Straw packing. One scrap of blue archive twine. Someone had been careful, not hurried. Whatever came out of here mattered enough to transport dry. Sermet pointed at the floor. Drag marks. Not heavy enough for equipment. Too narrow. Box edges. "How many?" Mara asked. 3 crates removed. Maybe 4 boxes. Maybe more if stacked. Bellick glanced at the burned shelves. Then either were late or somebody came back for what the fire missed. Mara stood and looked toward the hall where the warped doors led deeper into the annex. "We haven't checked the lower tunnel." The drainage tunnel entrance sat behind a bent metal partition beneath the loading bay. The lock had been cut, not forced by blast. That alone was enough to tighten the air around the team. Petter tested the hinge, while Ilsa checked the wall for trip lines or recent bracing. None. The door opened on a smell of wet limestone, rust, and old paper turned sweet by rot. A set of concrete steps dropped into darkness. Sermet reached for a lamp. Mara caught his wrist lightly. "Listen first." They stood in blackness. Water dripped at irregular intervals. Somewhere farther in, a scrape. Not animal. 2 waited. Then stillness. Bellick's jaw hardened. "We're not alone." Mara nodded once. Positions shifted without words. Sanaa stayed at the stairs with the rear angle. Petter and Ilsa took the left wall. Sermet mirrored Mara right. Bellick led 2 steps ahead, where caution and impatience balanced best in him. The tunnel widened after 20 meters into a lower storage gallery lined with cracked shelves, and paper cartons collapsed into damp pulp. One electric conduit ran overhead, dead long ago. Their lamps cut narrow cones through floating dust. On the far side, a second chamber stood partially blocked by fallen masonry. Near it lay 1 open crate and 2 waterproof wraps stripped from whatever they had once protected. Bellick moved closer. Archive seals. Mara crouched by the wrapping. Caustic's name. Partial. Enough. The scrape came again, this time from beyond the fallen masonry. Sermet started to raise his rifle too quickly. Mara pressed the barrel down with 2 fingers. "Alive," she whispered. "How do you know?" "Because a dead shift falls once." Bellick almost smiled despite himself. They crossed the chamber by fractions. Petter eased a broken shelf aside. Ilsa shone the lamp through the gap. "There," she breathed. A man sat against the far wall with one ankle trapped beneath a slab of broken concrete and one hand wrapped in a filthy bandage. Not old, maybe 35. Civilian coat, smuggler's boots, beard grown in unevenly. His pupils shrank hard at the light, and his free hand came up not toward a weapon, but toward his face, shielding. "Don't," he said. "Please don't shoot. I can't move." Bellick kept his rifle fixed on the man's chest. "Name?" The man hesitated. That hesitation told Mara the first answer would be false. Darren. Bellick snorted. Try again. The man swallowed. Miklos. Better. Sanaa was already moving to assess the trapped leg. Mara let her. Pain made liars simpler. What was in the boxes? Mara asked. Miklos looked between uniforms, trying to decide which authority might be bribed, flattered, or pitted. He chose pity first. Wrong instinct. I only moved what they paid me to move. Who paid you? A broker. I never met the buyer. Bellick leaned closer. Then you should start impressing me with the broker. Miklos winced as Sanaa touched the swollen ankle. In the market town beyond the line. Calls himself Various. That's all I know. Not enough, Bellick said. Mara crouched, so the lamp lit not his whole face but one eye and half his mouth. People lied better when they could perform with symmetry. Which boxes? She asked. The notebooks. Survey books. Rolled overlays. One small brass case. Mara felt the slide rule in her pocket without touching it. Caustics. I don't know names. They said old officer papers. Where now? Gone east. 2 nights ago. With whom? Miklos wet his lips. There was a woman. Dark coat. Burn scar at the neck. And another man I didn't see well. He stayed outside. Bellick frowned. Military? Miklos hesitated again. Mara said, If you lie now, your next sentence will matter to men less patient than me. His eyes darted to Bellick. Sensible enough. The outside man used military turns of phrase, he said. Not from here. Not ours either. And he kept asking if there was a second bundle in oilcloth. The room seemed to constrict by 1 degree. Caustics folded field pages, or something tied to them. Sermet spoke before he could stop himself. Burin. Miklos flinched at the name. Too sharply. Not recognition from rumor. Recognition from recent hearing. Mara saw it. You heard that name from him, she said. Miklos shut his eyes. Bellick stepped forward. Wait, Mara said. She looked at Miklos's face, not his trapped leg. Did he speak to you directly? A pause. Yes. What did he ask? Miklos opened his eyes again, defeated now not by force, but by the realization that precision had already gone past his defenses. He asked if I knew how to pack wax paper around the corners so damp wouldn't take the pencil before the border. He said paper dies faster than men if it isn't handled properly. That was Luca, not because of the content, because of the hierarchy inside it. Paper first. Preservation as control. What else? Miklos's voice dropped. He said if a woman came later asking for the notebooks, I was not to shoot at her unless I was certain it was her left hand holding the lamp. Bellick looked sharply at Mara. Why the left hand? Sermet whispered. Mara answered without taking her eyes off Miklos. Because my right hand draws faster. The young lieutenant went very still. There it was. The next thread opening. Luca had expected her, not merely as an investigator, as an equal. Sanaa finally looked up from the trapped ankle. If we move the slab carefully, he keeps the foot. If not, maybe not. Bellick muttered. Today is full of mercy. Mara almost said nothing, then heard Caustic's line in memory, and chose differently. Move it carefully. Petter and Ilsa built leverage with a steel bar and broken shelving strut. Sermet took the weight where Mara showed him. On 3, they shifted the slab enough for Sanaa to drag the leg free. Miklos screamed once, then bit down on the sleeve of his own coat and made no further sound. Sanaa splinted the ankle with a snapped crate board and bandage strips. Bellick watched the whole thing with the expression of a man remembering arguments he no longer had the strength to continue. You know he would have sold the rest if he'd found it. Yes, Mara said. And we're carrying him out anyway. Yes. He grunted. Good. I'd have hated being the only one in this tunnel who remembered what she meant. They searched the lower gallery for another hour. Under collapsed shelving, they found 1 sealed packet of calibration tables, 2 partial baseline overlays, and a narrow waterproof cylinder containing meteorological notebooks from 3 winters earlier. Valuable, but not what Mara needed most. The main field journals were gone. So was the small brass case Miklos mentioned. And somewhere east, beyond a line everybody was pretending meant something, Luca Burin either had them or intended to. At the tunnel mouth, just before they left, Sermet called softly. Here. He was pointing to the back of the cut lock, hanging on its twisted staple. Someone had scratched into the rust with a fine tool. Not recently enough to shine, but recently enough to outlast the rain. Not a word. A number. 97. No one in the team needed it explained. Bellick swore under his breath. Sanaa looked away. Even Sermet understood enough by then to know that 97 in this story was not random. It was Serret Causeway, Caustic's most condemned act. The number the living still argued about because it made mercy measurable and therefore inescapable. "He wants you to follow," Bellick said. "Yes." "He wants you angry." "No." "What then?" Mara looked at the scratch number until rust and memory blurred together. "He wants to know whether I learned the whole lesson." They carried Miklos out on a field stretcher made from engineer poles and canvas from the truck bed. The sky had gone silver toward evening, clouds flattening into one long lid over the ridge. On the way back to the vehicles, they found the place where the outside man had waited. One flattened patch of grass, one cigarette paper folded and left under a stone, one boot print at the edge of washout mud. The print told little beyond discipline and weight distribution. The folded paper told more. Inside was a hand-drawn firing fan, elegant and spare, showing 3 false battery sectors and 1 true withdrawal corridor no official map carried. At the bottom, in the same tight script found in the charred map case after Galen Gap, were 7 words. "She still listens before the second echo." Bellick read over Mara's shoulder. "He left you instruction or insult. I can't decide which." "Both," Mara said. Sermet stood very still beside them. "Why help?" Mara folded the note. "Because he is not helping me. He is arranging the question." "What question?" She looked east toward the unseen border. Whether restoration and pursuit can still be separated. Nobody had an answer ready for that. By the time they reached the academy after midnight, the rain had returned. Tribunal officers were waiting in the administration room with dry pens, hungry faces, and the special bureaucratic patience reserved for people who believe information became theirs the moment it entered a building under guard. Raiden intercepted most of them in the corridor like an old gun captain stepping between an unsteady lieutenant and the wrong radio frequency. Mara heard only pieces as she passed with Sanaa and the stretcher. "No, you cannot question him tonight. No, if you insist on writing that phrase, spell meteorological correctly. No, the lieutenant is not available for your summary board." That almost made her smile. Miklos survived the night. So did the tribunal men's frustration. The academy infirmary smelled of soap, ether, damp wool, and boiled herbs from some civilian remedy. Sanaa still trusted more than the official tablets when pain settled deep in bone. Mara went there before sunrise after 3 hours sleep that did not feel like sleep so much as the temporary suspension of standing. Miklos was awake, ankle elevated, eyes red with the shame of still being alive among uniforms. He looked at her as if expecting either gratitude for cooperation or punishment for delay. Mara offered neither. "The woman with the burn scar," she said. "Describe her again." He licked dry lips. "Tall. Military posture, even in civilian clothes. Scar just above the collar line, left side." She checked the packing herself. She knew what not to bend. Accent, not local. Northern, maybe, or taught out of it. Age, 40, armed, yes. Confident. Miklos gave a weak, humorless laugh. Enough that she didn't need to prove it. Sanaa adjusted a drip without looking over. There are entire armies made of people like that. Mara considered the description. Not enough for a face. Enough for a category. Former intelligence. Transport specialist. Someone trusted with archives and cross-line movement. Someone Luca would use only if the material mattered to him beyond tactics. Did she call him by name? Mara asked. Miklos hesitated. No. Did he call her by name? Another pause. Then he called her Taisa. Bellick, who had entered behind Mara, carrying coffee in 2 cups and fatigue in both shoulders, stopped mid-step. Taisa Drev, he said quietly, if it's the same woman. Mara turned. Bellick set the cups down. Border Recovery Service before the collapse. Then Special Transport Liaison. She handled prisoner exchanges, body returns, sealed archive moves, anything too sensitive for normal trucks and too deniable for uniform escorts. Smart. Hard. Disappeared after the second capital evacuation. Loyal to whom? Mara asked. Bellick gave one his flat little shrugs. Whichever side was paying in routes instead of slogans. That fit. Miklos watched them and understood he had said something useful at last. Will that help me? Sanaa answered before Mara could. A splint helped you. Beyond that, don't negotiate while horizontal. Miklos subsided. The next 3 days became a contest between public closure and private momentum. The tribunal wanted Halden processed, documented, and framed as an exception because systems preferred isolated corruption to structural failure. The Academy wanted recovered notebooks cataloged. Intelligence wanted to own the intercepts about Luca without admitting that their prior declaration of his likely death had been convenient fiction. Mara wanted one thing only, the route east. She got it not from intelligence, but from a student. On the 4th morning, the ink-handed cadet from the 2nd row asked permission to speak after class and placed a market ledger on Mara's desk with the tentative confidence of someone not yet accustomed to being useful to serious people. My uncle trades wool near the demarcation crossings, the cadet said. He keeps old transport tallies because he thinks peace will eventually tax memory. I saw the name VAR in one of your request sheets posted at administration. There's a mule train broker using that alias near Cayman Ford. Mara opened the ledger. Half the entries meant nothing. 3 did. Repeated shipments marked as tool parts and chalk paper moving east in weights too low for machinery and too high for stationary. 1 destination name reused as code. 1 escort notation, TD. Tysadrev, where's your uncle now? Mara asked. Home by the South Mill. Unless he heard taxes are coming. Bellick, leaning in the doorway, exhaled through his nose. I like this student. Mara looked at the cadet. You have said nothing to anyone else about this. No. Good. The girl hesitated. Did I do something wrong? No, Mara said. You listened before the 2nd echo. The cadet did not fully understand, but the pride in her face told Mara she would remember the line anyway. By late afternoon, Raiden had the route laid out on 3 maps, and the expression of a man deeply resigned to the fact that peace had not reduced his workload so much as diversified its absurdities. Cayman Ford isn't a 4 anymore, he said. Bridge gone 2 years. Crossing now done by cable raft and bad judgment. Smugglers use the uppercut when water is low. Which it is. You're coming, Bellick said. It was not a question. Raiden looked offended. Of course I'm not coming. I'm old enough to have earned the right to send younger people towards stupid terrain while I manage the consequences from chair. Bellick almost smiled. Raiden tapped the eastern ridge line. But I'm sending Sermet again. The young lieutenant, standing at the side table with more maps than experience, straightened. Mara expected protest from Bellick. Instead, he only asked why. Because he has begun to understand the difference between procedure and judgment, Raiden said. And because if he survives 5 more years without that understanding, he'll become exactly the kind of officer this country can least afford. Sermet absorbed that with surprising steadiness. Raiden's gaze shifted to Mara. This is not a recovery mission anymore. No, it may become an exchange, or an ambush, or an invitation designed by a man who wants to be understood more than he wants to be forgiven. Yes, and if you find Caustic's journals? Mara rolled the map back up halfway, considering the weight of the question rather than the wording. Then I bring them home. All of them, if possible. And if Burin can only be stopped by destroying them where they are. The room thinned. Bellick looked from one to the other, but did not interfere. At last Mara answered, Then I choose what passes across the target. Raiden held her eyes for a long second. It was not approval he gave. It was recognition. Good, he said quietly. That's the answer I hoped was expensive. Night gathered in the windows while the maps stayed spread, while routes were traced and retraced, while equipment was selected not for quantity, but for necessity. One lamp buzzed overhead. Rain tapped once and passed. Somewhere in the courtyard, cadets were still reciting grid procedure to each other because young people believed repetition could tame uncertainty, and sometimes they were right. When the room finally emptied, Mara remained alone with the maps, the ledger, the recovered note from the grass, and Caustic's folded page beside the brass slide rule. She opened the old mentor's note once more, tracing the worn pencil line with her eyes until the words seemed less like instruction and more like a measurement. She was still inside. Precision is mercy you can measure. She had used it to save a road. She had used it to expose a traitor. Now she might have to use it to decide whether a legacy belonged on shelves, in doctrine, or in fire. Outside, a truck engine turned over. Bellick's voice carried faintly through the corridor, checking fuel, checking straps, checking the practical things that kept higher questions from killing people too early. Beyond him, somewhere past the academy walls and the rebuilding town and the wet black fields, the eastern hills waited in layered dark. Kamenford, Tysadrev, Luca Burin, Kostik's missing notebooks crossing from archive and debate. Mara folded the page, returned it to the oilcloth, and slipped the slide rule into her pocket over her heart. Then she extinguished the lamp. In the dark, she listened first. Only rain in the gutter. Only the far metal knock of a loose hinge. Only the breathing of a building full of tired people preparing to move before dawn. For the moment, that was enough. But east of the ridge, where paper was being carried through bad roads by careful hands, another question was already arranging itself. And this time survival might not be the hardest part. This time it might be deciding what must be preserved, what must be denied, and how many seconds mercy was worth when the legacy of the dead could still be turned into aim points by the living. Before sunrise, they would begin measuring that answer.